All right, you guys ready to jump in? Awesome, awesome. So let's go ahead and dive in. You guys, this passage, there's so much going on in this passage. You probably have so many questions, and we're going to try our best and respond to most of them. That's kind of what this chapter represents. This is Paul's Q&R, his question and response, as it shows in the title, to the married, the widowed, the divorced, and to the single Pringles. That is who this part of the letter is for. Now, if you remember, this is really important. Paul had written the Corinthians a letter which we don't have access to. That's the real 1 Corinthians. We don't have access to that letter. And they responded to that letter by writing Paul a letter. And the letter that you and I have, called 1 Corinthians, is Paul's response to that letter. Does that make sense? So 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians. It's the second letter that Paul wrote them. And he is responding to a previous letter that they wrote to him in response to his first letter. Now, Corinth, if you know anything about Corinth, it was a Greek city known for rampant sexual license. In fact, the term Corinthian was actually slang for prostitutes. They would say, oh, she's a real Corinthian if she's loose and sells her body. Now, Paul went and he preached the gospel early AD 50s. Some people got saved. About 50 to 100 people gave their allegiance to King Jesus. The church in Corinth was born. And if you remember, this is really important, many of the Corinthians started referring to themselves as pneumatikoi. Can you guys say pneumatikoi? Pneumatikoi. And that means spirit people. They called themselves the spirit people. And they were influenced by this pagan philosophy that taught that the spiritual is good and the physical is bad. Again, that's not in the Bible. The Bible does not teach that. That is heresy. That is Platonic dualism, and many of us have been taught that in the church. That spiritual good, physical bad, that is not in the Bible at all. But that's what these people believe. Spirit people. Physical bad, spiritual good. So when you have a group of people like that in a culture that is obsessed with sex, two people groups form. One people group says, hey, we're spirit people, so what we do with our bodies doesn't matter at all. It's of little consequence. And this group, this first group, made up of mostly men, go and sleep with a bunch of prostitutes. Because it doesn't matter what you do with your body, right? We're spirit people. What we do with our body doesn't matter. Now, Paul already addressed that group. He addressed that group, remember, last week with all of their issues, talked about the importance of the body and the resurrection. Your body will be resurrected one day, so what you do with it now matters. But then there's a second group of people. And this group is made up of, we believe, mostly women. And they were saying this, hey, we're spirit people. The new age has dawned on us. Sex and marriage are part of the old age that is passing away. We're basically angels, they would say. Now, that's not true. That's not true. When you die and you're resurrected, you don't become an angel. But they believe we're angels. And Jesus taught that angels don't get married. So either, one, we should either not have sex at all, even if we already are married, or number two, if we are married, we should get divorced. And Paul says, full stop. Full stop. Absolutely not. That is not right at all. Now notice in the first verse of chapter 7, this is really important. Paul quotes the Corinthians letter to him. Your Bible probably has quotation marks in that first verse because this is important. This is not Paul's thoughts or his beliefs. This is the belief of the Corinthians. And he is quoting their letter back to them and correcting their sayings to him. And so this is what the Corinthians say. It is good for a man to not touch a woman, is what it says literally in Greek, as in have sex with her. The word touch there means to have sex with her. And they were saying this, the Corinthians were saying this about husbands and wives, basically saying it's good for husbands and wives to never have sex, that they shouldn't have sex at all. Now, the Greek word here for woman, a man should not touch a woman, it really means wife. A man should not touch his wife. And Paul says, listen though, because of the temptation to porneia, which in this case involves a bunch of men going out and sleeping with prostitutes. Because that is happening, each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband. Now, this is really important. He is not talking to single people here. He is still talking to married people. This is really important. The word have here means to have sex with. He's not saying, oh, everyone should go take their own wife. He would use the word take as in get married. He's not saying that. He's saying, hey, you're married, you should have sex only with your spouse and with nobody else. The husband, Paul says, should give his wife her conjugal rights. And you're like, what the heck does that mean? That sounds disgusting. Like, her conjugal rights. Oh, what is that? Sounds oppressive. That sounds like prison. No, conjugal rights. That word conjugal there in Greek, it just means her duty. The duty of the wife. What is the duty of the wife towards her husband? To have sex. To have sex with him. In the same way, the wife should fulfill her duty to her husband. The husband should fulfill his duty to his wife, and the wife should fulfill her duty to her husband, which in this case is to have sex with them, their conjugal rights. It means their duty. And in this case, it's a sexual duty. Now, Paul is not suggesting, this is really important, this passage has been so misinterpreted, misapplied, and led to so many abuses in marriage. Paul is not suggesting, he is not suggesting that a spouse can demand sex from their spouse. He's not saying that at all. Sex is not to be held at a distance. It is not a reward for good behavior. It is not a weapon to wield. Sex is the duty of each spouse toward one another. It isn't the privilege of the husband and the duty of the wife. It is just as much the privilege of the wife and the duty of the husband. Which doesn't mean that you can say to your spouse, you cannot, when you get married, you cannot say to your spouse, hey, you owe me this. You cannot say that to them. No, Paul is saying that you need to say to your spouse, I owe you. It's not you owe me, it's I owe you. Does that make sense? That's very different. You can't say, you owe me this. It's no, I owe you. My body is yours. He says the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Now, in Paul's day, in his culture, there was nothing controversial about that statement. The husband owns his wife. She is his property. The wife belongs to the husband. And if he wanted to have an affair or go sleep with some prostitutes, he could absolutely do that. No one would bat an eye. But the next part is the shocking part. Likewise, Paul says, in the same way, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. The husband's body does not belong to him alone, but it belongs to his wife. Not his girlfriend, not even his fiance, but his wife. His wife. He can't go sleep with prostitutes. He can't go have an affair, and neither spouse can withhold sex from one another. Now notice, Paul uses a word here that I want you guys to see. It's the word authority. He uses the word authority here. Now personally, I'm just going to lay my cards on the table. I do believe in male headship in marriage if you and I understand the word headship accurately and biblically. We usually kind of like, we have connotations of that word headship, and we kind of put that onto the biblical authors. That's not what the word kephale, head, means. But if we understand headship correctly, I do believe in male headship in the marriage. But notice this, the only time in Scripture that Paul ever uses the word authority, the Greek word exousia, when talking about marriage, is this passage right here. It's the only time you see marriage talked about and the word authority comes up. And the word authority here, exousia, is completely mutual. Do you notice that? This is really important. Don't miss that. Are husbands head of household? Sure. But the only time the word authority is used in reference to marriage, it does not say the husband has authority. It says they both have authority. Does that make sense? They have authority over one another. And again, what Paul is not saying is that you can demand sex from one another. But he is saying that we can't deprive each other if we're married. We can't deprive each other. We can't demand, but we also can't deprive. Now that word deprive there literally means to defraud. It's the same word, if you remember from last week's passage, where there was two Christians going to court with one another. They were suing each other, trying to get each other's stuff. The word defraud there, deprive, means to take from someone what rightfully belongs to them. Don't take from your spouse what rightfully belongs to them. Sex is a very important part of a healthy, flourishing covenant marriage. But please hear me. What Paul does not want to happen, and I've seen this happen, you guys, in ministry, I've seen this, and it's disgusting, it's horrible, it's scary. What Paul does not want to happen is that you hear his words, you go home to your spouse, and you say, your body is mine. No, Paul wants you to go home to your spouse and say, my body is yours. That's very different. He does not want you. The application tonight is when you get married to look at your spouse and say, your body is mine. No, Paul wants you to be able to say, my body is yours. And if both parties, if both spouses can do that, it leads to a very healthy sex life. Now, because here's the thing, in that scenario, either partner has the right to say no, because they both have authority, but they are not to deprive one another. But Paul says, if you do deprive one another, like if there's a season of your life where y'all don't have sex at all, that's off the table for a few weeks or a few months, you can do that. There's one exception. There's one reason to deprive one another. And one exception with two conditions. Number one, if you both agree on it. And number two, if it's for a limited time. So that y'all can devote y'all-selves to prayer, is what it says in Greek, but then come together again so that you don't leave yourself vulnerable for the Satan to tempt you due to your lack of self-control. Again, he's talking to married people, not single people. This is really important. Not singles. He is talking to men who are having sex with prostitutes, married men having sex with prostitutes, and mostly women who are denying their husband sex on the grounds of, hey, we're spirit people, and we should not have sex because sex is bad and it's gross and it's part of the old age. Paul isn't saying, here's the thing, and Paul's not saying, please don't mishear Paul, Paul isn't saying that the men sleeping with prostitutes, that's the woman's fault, or that it's her problem. I mean, partly, but he's not saying like the primary blame is on the women for the men, their choice is sleeping with prostitutes. He isn't saying that it's the woman's problem, but he is saying that the women can be part of the solution, part of the journey to purity. And I would argue the strongest deterrent to sexual immorality for a married person, again, we're not talking about single, we're talking about married still. The strongest deterrent to sexual immorality for a married person is real intimacy with your spouse. Because the real thing, sexual intimacy in a covenant marriage, that is so much better than the cheap parody that they are running after as they go and have sex with all these prostitutes. That is a cheap parody, and the real thing is so much better and more life-giving and leads to human flourishing. And Paul says, listen, I'm telling you this as a concession, not as a command. Like, y'all don't have to abstain for a long season, a few weeks, a few months, to devote yourselves to fasting and prayer, but if you both decide to, you can do that if you want to. This is so cool. Notice, most of this chapter is not Paul giving commands and rules, but concessions and godly wisdom from a man filled with the Spirit of God. I think it was Nick Childs asked a really good question. We're going to get to it earlier in the series about this text specifically. Paul's constantly saying, not I but the Lord, not the Lord but I. A lot of this chapter is it's not commands and rules and regulations. It's wisdom. It's advice from a godly, Spirit-filled man. Paul says, I wish that every single person here was as I was. And what was Paul? What was Paul's marital status? Yes, he was single. Yes. He says, but each has his own gift from God. One has this kind of gift, and one has that kind of gift. So here's what Paul's saying. Marriage, that's a gift. And singleness is a gift. The word gift there is charismata. Can you guys say charismata? Charismata, yeah. That's the same word for gifts of the Spirit. Hey, sweetheart. Hey, sweetheart. I haven't seen you in a few hours. How you doing? How are you? Hey, what's up? You want to stay here with me? Yeah? Do you want to teach with me? Are the lights too blinding? Yeah? What's up? Hey, it's okay. It's okay. What's up? What's up? You want to stay with me? You want to stay with me? Hey, that's okay if you want to stay with me. I can teach down here. Okay, you're going to go to Cheerios? That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. Okay, so charismata. So do you guys understand? Marriage, gift. Singleness, gift. And the word gift there is the same word for gifts from the Spirit. So you guys are going to hear this. You're not going to like what I'm about to say, but all of you need to hear it. Singleness is a spiritual gift. And please don't misunderstand, it is not a Christian superpower for the select few who can easily brush off sexual temptation like crumbs on a t-shirt. You all, every single person in here, I'm looking at all of you, I know every one of you has the gift of singleness. And you know how I know? Because you're not married. Every single one of you is not, no, you literally do. You have the gift of singleness. You do. You do. I know you do because you're not married. Even if you're dating someone, you're still single. You're still not married. The gift of singleness, the gift, whatever it is, marriage or singleness, the gift is the current state that you're in. That's the gift, the current state that you're actually in right now. Yeah, Charlie. Do you have the gift receipt? What's that? I will give you the gift receipt on your wedding day. Anyway, so yes, I will print it out and everything. It'll be great. So listen, and here's the thing, and please, to be fair, and to be sure, there are definitely some people who have the gift of singleness for their whole lives, and some people have it for only a chunk of their lives. It isn't a curse. Please hear this tonight. Singleness is not a curse. You all, even when you get married, you are still followers of a single Jewish rabbi named Yeshua, named Jesus. He was single, and all of you follow him. He is your master, your rabbi, and you are all his disciples, his apprentices, his methetes, his followers. And so it's not a curse. Now, some of you may even have the unique and special ability or calling to participate in the kingdom as a single person, maybe even for your whole lives. Some people do have that gift, and that's not weird. And if one of you does have that gift of singleness, listen, that doesn't mean that you don't want to be married. People think, oh, I want to be married, which means I don't have the gift of singleness. Not necessarily. Or that it's easy. Like, some people think I have the gift of singleness, it means it's easy to be single. Not necessarily. I have the gift of teaching, right? Now, is teaching always easy for me? No, not necessarily. Doesn't mean teaching's always easy for me, or that I necessarily always want to do it. I'm going to be honest with you guys. There are nights where I'm cranky and tired and frustrated, and I don't even want to do the thing that I'm called to do, that I've gifted in. But it's worth it. But I'm still going to do it. What was that? So we know. Yes, oh, you know. But it's worth it. I still do it because it's worth it. So here's the point. Singleness, and you are single, that's a good thing. Married people in the church, you need to hear this tonight, are not varsity, and single are not JV. Your life, and some of you need to hear this because some of you, you're not going to admit this verbally, but you're still believing a lie right now. And you believe the lie that your life is going to begin when you say, I do to a spouse. Your life does not begin when you say, I do to a spouse. Your life begins when you say, I will follow Jesus. That is when your life begins. Not when you say, I do, but when you say, I will follow you, Jesus. Now, we'll get back to single people in a second. Paul's not addressing them there. He's still addressing married people. He's still talking to the marrieds. But Callista, you had something.
Well, like
Yeah. If you have that unique and special calling. Yes, yeah. And that's the thing. I'd say, again, I think all of you have the gift right now because you're all in that current state of singleness. Now you're asking, how do you know you're in it for life? You don't know. Here's what I'll say, Callista. Paul is going to talk a lot to single people at the end of the passage. I'm going to get to that. And if Paul doesn't answer it then, if he doesn't respond to that question, let me know. And we'll come back to it. Yeah. So great question. Yeah, Thomas.
Paul was a Pharisee. Where does white go?
What's that?
Paul was a Pharisee. Where does white go?
Yeah, Paul, there's a belief that Paul, he was a Pharisee, he was a rabbi. Many rabbis Paul's age were probably married. And so if you were a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Sanhedrin, you had to be married. And some people believe that Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin. The Bible never explicitly says that, but he was trained under Rabbi Gamaliel, so it's very likely he could have been a member of the Sanhedrin. And if he was, that means he was married. And if he was married, it means that at this point in his life, his wife must have died. He must be widowed. Which, interestingly, the next section is about widowers and widows. And he says to the widows and widows, I wish you could be single as I am. Kind of implying like my wife died and now I'm a widower. I wish you guys were like me and you could stay single. So it's possible. Again, we don't know explicitly in Scripture, but it's possible that Paul, he's definitely single by this point, but maybe he had a wife who died. We don't know for sure, though. But that was a great question. So Paul is not talking to singles. He's still talking to married people. Then he addresses another group. And this group right here is called the unmarried and the widows. Now, the word for unmarried here is agamos. Can you guys say agamos? This is really important, agamos. And the word agamos could refer to persons who were once married. So most scholars actually believe that when Paul uses the word agamos, he is addressing widowers here. Men whose wives have died, widowers, which is why he pairs them with widows, the unmarried, the agamos, and the widows, the widowers and the widows. The normal word for people who haven't been married at all, that's parthenos. And he's going to use that word later to address that group, all those people. There's going to be a whole section at the end that we're going to get to, which is addressed to the parthenos. But he's not talking to parthenos here, he's talking to agamos. So it's probably widowers and widows. In the ancient world, if you're a widow or a widower, odds are you're going to get married again really soon. Odds are you may already be engaged. And Paul says, listen, if you widows and widowers can remain single like me, that's great. But if you can't exercise self-control, then you should get married. For it's better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, this is really important, really important. That phrase, cannot control themselves, is better translated are not controlling themselves, present tense. Don't miss this. It doesn't say cannot control themselves. It says they are not currently, presently controlling themselves. They are currently engaging in sexual immorality, probably with the people they're engaged to or the people that they're planning to be engaged to. And Paul is saying, listen, y'all should probably just go ahead and get married. Like, does that make sense? What Paul is not saying, and the way that this verse is usually taken is if you're a single person with a high libido and low self-control, you should probably go find a spouse because you obviously don't have the gift of singleness. That's how this verse is often taken, and I don't think that's what Paul is saying at all. That's not what Paul is saying. Does that make sense? Do you understand? A lot of people read that verse, they're like, oh, I better not burn with passion. I burn with passion. I have a high libido, low self-control, so I need to get married. I don't have the gift of celibacy. That's not what Paul is saying. You and I, every single one of us, we are all called to self-control. Self-control is a fruit of the Spirit, which all of you have, which we all have. He is not talking to singles here. He is talking to widows and widowers who are having sex with the people that they're probably going to marry. They're displaying a lack of self-control, and he is calling them to marriage. Now, the better vocation would be to remain single. Singleness would be the better vocation here. It is good to remain as y'all are. But in this case, getting married would be good. Now, to those who are married, this is important. To those who are married, he gives them this charge. And then Paul quickly clarifies. He says, not I, but the Lord. Not I, but the master, the kurios, the king. What does Paul mean here? Paul is saying, what I'm about to say to you, I did not come up with this. This is directly from the teachings of Jesus. And according to Jesus, does that make sense? Not I, but the Lord. He's saying this is from the Gospels, this is from the teaching of Jesus, it's not from me. According to Jesus, and specifically the teachings of Jesus on marriage and divorce and remarriage in Matthew 19, the wife should not divorce her husband. But if she does divorce her husband, she should remain unmarried or reconcile to her husband. God's heart is always repentance and forgiveness and reconciliation. That is always God's heart. Divorce is never commanded in Scripture. It's never commanded, ever. God hates divorce, but it is allowed. Divorce is allowed on certain circumstances. Now, Paul, he's assuming that his audience is pretty familiar with Jesus' teachings on marriage and divorce, so he doesn't elaborate on it here. And we really don't have time to go and read all of Matthew 19, but I would encourage you to go read that later if you haven't already read that passage. But here's the point. Here's what you need to know. Divorce is a concession. It is not a command. And it's only for certain instances. You hear this phrase a lot in our culture, irreconcilable differences. So many divorces are a result of having irreconcilable differences. And that's not biblical at all. Just having irreconcilable differences is not justifiable means to ending a marriage covenant. In God's eyes, that covenant is still very much intact. Those two people are still married. Even if they say, oh, we divorced, we had irreconcilable differences, they're still married in God's eyes. And divorce and then remarriage after divorce, that would be adultery because they're still married. Unless the covenant has been legitimately broken, either by adultery, abandonment by an unbelieving spouse, which Paul is about to dive into in this passage, or I would even argue abuse or spousal neglect based on a couple passages. Again, I'm not just saying that because I believe that. I think, oh, it's wrong for men to beat their wives, so they should divorce. No, I actually believe that because of the scriptures. There are certain passages I can turn to and say, here's why I think abuse is legitimate breaking of the covenant, which does not mean divorce is commanded in that instance, but divorce is allowed in that instance. Does that make sense? So again, only under certain circumstances. In God's eyes, those two people still married, irreconcilable differences, not a good reason to end a marriage. Falling out of love, not a good reason to end a marriage. It's not. They're still married unless these activities broke the marriage covenant, in which case the covenant was legitimately broken and they are not married anymore. But don't miss Paul's point. Don't miss Paul's point. To the married person, Paul says, remain as you are. Don't get divorced. Don't get divorced. And if you do get divorced, be reconciled. That's the ideal scenario. That's God's heart. Or remain unmarried. Now, to the rest, Paul says this, not the Lord, but I. As in, Jesus has nothing to say about this next situation that I'm going to address, is what Paul is saying. He's going to address believers who are married to unbelievers. Believers who are married to unbelievers. Now, this is really important. Paul is not for that. Paul is not for mixed marriages. Paul would not be pro-missionary dating, you dating an unbeliever trying to save them. No, Paul is going to double down on that in the next section. If you're single and if you are a follower of Jesus, you need to marry someone who follows Jesus. But here, he's addressing a believer, someone who was formerly an unbeliever and who's married to another unbeliever, and one of them got saved, but the other one did not. Does that make sense? So like the way of Jesus is still very new in the first century. If a couple was to hear Paul preach on any given day, let's say one of them gets saved, but one of them does not get saved. Apparently, that was the situation in Corinth. A lot of believers with unbelieving spouses. And Paul's wisdom is this: if your unbelieving spouse is willing to stay with you, do not divorce them. That is still a marriage, even if they don't follow Jesus. That is still a sacred covenant in God's eyes. And why should they stay together? Paul says, for the unbelieving spouse is sanctified or made holy through the believing spouse. Otherwise, the children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. They are set apart. Now, this is important. What Paul is not saying is that being married to a Christian automatically makes you saved. But he is saying this: if you're one with Jesus, like you're a part of Jesus' body, you're one with Jesus, and you're also one with this person through marriage, then that person isn't one with Jesus fully yet, not yet at least, but there is this sphere of influence. Does that make sense? You're in Jesus, you're one with Jesus, they're one with you, they're not in Jesus yet, but there's this sphere of influence. The presence of a follower of Jesus in that house makes it, not guaranteed, but more likely that the spouse and the children will come to know Jesus. The believer's body is filled with the Spirit, it's heaven on earth, and they're bringing that sacred space into their household. But let's say, for argument's sake, let's say they leave you. Let's just say they leave you. Let's say they can't stand your commitment to Jesus and your resolute determination to live for him, and they want a divorce. That was a very common experience in the first century. Usually the patriarch, the guy, the husband, he kind of controlled religious matters. If you were his wife, you would adopt his gods. So a bunch of women are saying, hey, I'm not going to worship your gods anymore, the Romans or the Greek gods. I'm going to worship Jesus alone. And he might be like, okay, then I'm out. Then I'm going to divorce you. If that happens, in that case, Paul says, let the unbelieving partner separate. Let them walk away. A believing spouse is not enslaved. Translation, they are free to remarry. God has called us to peace. Because practically, this is Paul speaking with wisdom here. How do you know whether you're going to be able to save your unbelieving spouse? You don't know that. There's no guarantees. So then Paul makes the point he's trying to drive home in this whole chapter. This is really important. Don't miss this. He says, let each person walk in the way that the master has assigned to him and to which God has called him. I'll read that again one more time. Let each person walk in the way the master has assigned him and to which God has called him. This is Paul's rule in all the churches. How do you say this a different way? Be content where you are at. The state of life that you were in when you were called by Jesus, live in that state. If you aren't married, but you were at one time, then stay single if you're able to. If you were married to a believer or an unbeliever and then you got saved, stay married. If you were already circumcised when you got saved, like you were Jewish before you started following Jesus, don't try to erase that, which I have no idea what that looks like, but it sounds disgusting. It sounds disgusting. Like, how do you, never mind. So don't get uncircumcised. That's gross. Don't do that, Paul says. And listen, if you were uncircumcised when you started following Jesus, you don't have to get circumcised. You don't have to become Jewish in order to follow Jesus. Being Jewish or not being Jewish, that doesn't really count for anything. That doesn't really matter. What counts is obedience. What counts is keeping the commands of God. It's following the teachings of Jesus. Each person, Paul says, each of y'all should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a slave when you got saved? When you were saved, the day you were saved, Paul's saying to his audience, were you a slave the day you got saved? Now, again, don't think transatlantic slave trade in the 17th through the 19th centuries. Slaves in the first century were often very well off financially. They could purchase their freedom. It was voluntary. Slavery back then was voluntary, not involuntary. It was debt slavery. It was economic. It was not racial. Now, slavery is still evil. It's still evil in any generation because you're still owning another human being. And for Paul's audience, a third of the empire were slaves. Many Jesus followers in the first century were slaves. And Paul says, listen, if that's you, if you're a slave and you just got saved, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You are no more a follower of Jesus if you were free. Like being a slave or being a free person, that doesn't make you any more Christian. But listen, if you can gain your freedom, Paul says, go for it. That's great. Like if you're a slave in the first century and you can gain your freedom, do it, man. That's awesome. Do it. But listen, if God called you when you were a slave, you are free in him. And the same thing, if you're free, if you're not a slave in the first century, you have free status. If you're free, if you aren't a slave and Jesus has called you, then you are now Jesus' slave. Does that make sense? If you were a slave and Jesus called you, you're free in Jesus. And if you were free and Jesus called you, you're now Jesus' slave. You are his slave. He is your master now. So if you are free and now you follow Jesus, you don't have to become a slave. You are no more a follower of Jesus if you became a slave. Jesus has bought you. Don't become a slave of people, Paul says. So, brothers, in whatever condition each person was called, let them remain there with God. The word remain there is the Greek word meno. It means to abide, to dwell there, live there. Stay there and make your home there with God. Serve Jesus in your present circumstances. In the circumstances in which Jesus saved you, serve him there. Don't wait for the next season of your life to go all in. Don't think, oh, like, you know what I mean? Like there's nothing wrong with desiring marriage. There's nothing wrong with desiring a change in your life status. But don't stake your contentment there. And also don't think that you're going to follow Jesus better when you get there, right? Don't think I'm going to be a better follower of Jesus once I'm married or once I have a house or like, no, dude, no. Our purpose is to image God. And we could do that regardless of the season or stage of life that we're in. Jesus imaged God better than anyone else, and he did that when he was single and when he was homeless. And so you don't need to have a home, and you don't need to be married in order to fully image God. You could do that right now. Now, the single people, all the single people, all of you are, I didn't plan that was the Spirit. All of you are asking this question, what about us? It's finally y'all's turn. Hooray. Anyway, so single, again, what does single mean? Not married, never been, like you guys are single, Parthenos, you guys are not married. And so what does Paul say to them? Paul gives it to them straight. He says, listen, I have no command from the Kyrios, from the master, from the king, from the Lord. I have no command. Jesus did not explicitly teach about y'all's single situation. But Paul says this, I'm going to give you my advice. As someone who by the mercies of the master is trustworthy. He's saying, I'm about to give you some of the best advice you will ever get in your life. He says, I think in view of the present crisis, it is good for a man to remain as he is. Now, this is really important. Remember, 1 Corinthians is not a book. It's a letter. It's a letter written to real people. He is talking to people. Paul didn't know that he was contributing to this thing called the Bible. You know what I mean? Like God knew, but Paul didn't know that. He wasn't thinking like, oh, it's going to be in this leather bound. No, Paul wasn't thinking like that. Like he's writing to real people. We're just hearing one side of a phone conversation. So the question is, what present crisis is Paul talking about? He says, in light of the present crisis, it's good to stay single. What present crisis is he referring to? I have no idea. We don't know. And anyone who says they know is lying. But We do know that there was a huge famine that happened in the Roman Empire in AD 53. So that seems to be what Paul is talking about. So you get it. Like, if it's hard to feed one mouth, it's probably not a good time to start a family, right? If it's hard for you to feed yourself, it's probably not a good time for you to get a wife and children. Honestly, there's wisdom with timing. So Paul would recommend, listen, if you're a man and you are bound to a wife, don't seek to be free. Don't get divorced. You're married, stay married. But if you are free from a wife, if you're not married, maybe don't seek a wife right now. But if you do get married, you haven't sinned. Like it's not wise to get married now, but it's not sinning. If you do marry, you haven't sinned. If a woman gets married, she hasn't sinned. Marriage is not a sin. But those who get married, Paul says, will have worldly troubles. And Paul says, I would spare you of that. Now, what does he mean? This is really important. Don't miss this. He says, the appointed time has grown short. This is a really important idea. Remember that for Paul's a Jew, and he's been raised on the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And in Paul's worldview, there's two ages. There's this age, right? And then there's the age to come. There's two ages. But with the coming of Jesus, something happened. The age to come has broken into this present age. The future has invaded the past. And even though we aren't in the fullness of the age to come, like we're not in the new creation yet, with the resurrection of Jesus and with the coming of the Spirit, that future age is here now in a very real way. We're in what Paul calls the overlap of the ages. So think of it like a Venn diagram, right? Two circles. This age to come. We're like in the middle. That's where you and I are in human history. We are in the dawn of a new creation. The new age is here. It's here right now. And the old age is passing away before our eyes. We are on the cusp of a whole new reality. So in light of that, Paul says we need to live differently. From now on, those who have wives, those who are married, should live as if they're not married. And you're like, what? Those who have wives should live as if they have none. This is for y'all. You're single. If you get married one day, you're going to be married, but you are to live as if you're not. What does that mean? What does that mean? What it doesn't mean is this. It doesn't mean that the man should be like a passive jerk who sits on the couch and watches TV all day and just ignores his bride. That is not what Paul means. But it does mean this, that their marriage and the way that they do marriage, two followers of Jesus, the way that we do marriage, it's going to look so different from the world and how marriages operate in this present age. Because remember, if this was news to you, there won't be marriage in the new creation. When Jesus comes back, age to come, there's not going to be marriage in the new creation. That's a temporary thing. Marriage is a temporary thing. You know what else is temporary? Tears. Tears are temporary. We're not going to cry in the age to come. Paul says, let those who mourn live as if they do not mourn. You know what else won't be in the new creation? The stuff that you and I own, our possessions. Paul says, if you have possessions, you need to live as if you don't own any of it. It's not actually yours, and it's a gift from God. You don't own it, and you're not going to take it with you. When you buy stuff, it's not to own it. It's not so that it become yours, because it's going to burn up one day anyway. Does that make sense? You are to live as if you have no possessions, as if it's not really yours, you don't own any of it. If we rejoice in this age, if we deal with the world, Paul says we should live sometimes as if we're not celebrating, as if we're not dealing with the world. For two followers of Jesus who are married, their marriage has a calling. It is a temporary sign pointing forward towards the future age, which is here now in a real way, in a very real way. Does that make sense? And knowing that the new creation is coming and the new creation's here now. It's already but not yet. It's here now, but it's not yet here. In the new creation, there's not going to be marriage. And that new creation's here right now, which is why Paul says, if you're married, you should live as if you are not. Knowing that your marriage is a temporary sign pointing forward toward that new age that's here now and it's coming, that should change everything about your marriage from the top down. And listen, please hear me. That does not mean that there aren't bills to pay. It doesn't mean there aren't kids to raise. But we do all of that in this overlap of the ages mindset, right? My marriage to Elizabeth is wonderful. Honestly, every day I spend with her is my favorite day. Every day I spend with her is my absolute favorite day. But our marriage is temporary. It's temporary. One day, my left ring finger is going to be bare. Whether I die in 30 years or 30 minutes, the moment I die, our marriage is over. I'm serious. It's over. It will not resurrect. It's temporary. This part of my identity will not last forever. And so in the present, it serves a purpose. In the present, our marriage, Elizabeth and I, our marriage does not exist for our marriage, right? Our relationship does not exist for the sake of our relationship. If your future marriage exists for the sake of your marriage, it will implode. Or at the very least, You might, not get divorced, and you might, like die one day with your spouse, but like, what will your marriage have accomplished? What will it have accomplished? Like, because the present form of this world is passing away, Paul says. And Paul isn't saying it will pass away. He's saying it is passing away, like before our eyes. You and I, we live in one foot in both worlds. We live with a foot in the old age, and we live in a foot in the age to come. We're not simply living in the days of Abraham, where all you would do is get married and have kids and try to enjoy life. We don't live in that age. But we also don't live in the age where there is no marriage. We live in both. And we need to be living for the world that is coming, not for the world that is passing away. And listen, there's nothing wrong with marriage, nothing wrong with it, or happiness, or possessions. But those things, as they presently exist, are all passing away right now before our eyes. So now, please hear me, now is not the time to be chasing after the American dream. Now is not the time to be chasing after those things which are passing away right now. So practically, how do we do this? How do we do this practically? Paul says, listen, I would like you all to be free from anxieties. Let's be honest, Paul says, the single man is concerned about the things of the master, the things of the king, how to please the king. The single man is concerned about how to please Jesus. The married man, Paul says, is concerned about worldly things, how to please his wife. His interests are divided. Now, Paul isn't saying, this is really important, Paul isn't saying that's bad, Paul is saying that's reality. That's not bad. Like my interests are divided. I want to serve Jesus and please him, but I also want to please Elizabeth. Like, that's not bad, that's just reality. A single woman is concerned about the things of Jesus, how to be holy in her body and holy in spirit. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait, when I get married, aren't I still going to be concerned about that? Well, sure. But you're also going to be concerned about how to please your husband. It's just the truth. Listen, if they weren't married, if two married followers of Jesus weren't married, if a woman was not married and she loves Jesus, she would have way more time and way more freedom to serve the king in ways that aren't really wise or accessible to married people, right? Because here's the thing, a good marriage, if you guys want to have a good marriage, it's going to require time and money and energy and a lifestyle. How a single guy in his 20s lives in an apartment with 12 other dudes is going to look so different if he's married with 2 kids. And if it looks exactly the same, then his marriage will die. It will suffer. She doesn't want to live like she's in a fraternity where your grocery budget is $50 a month and you turn off the heater sometimes just to save money. She doesn't want that. No woman wants that. Dude. But listen, if you have a good marriage, like if you're putting in the time and the energy and the money, you're serving one another, you're sacrificing for one another, you're caring for one another, that will, please hear me, don't be offended when I say this, that will limit your ability to serve Jesus and serve the kingdom. Just facts, it will. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, yes, but I'm still serving Jesus like in another way as I serve my family. And yeah, but Paul's just being real with us here. He's just being real with us here. Your availability shrinks the moment you get married, it shrinks in half. Your time is cut in half the moment you get married. And when you have kids, it's cut in half again. You know what I mean? It is. It just is. Your availability will shrink. And Paul says, he's not saying that's a bad thing. He's just saying that's reality. And Paul says, listen, I am saying this to y'all's benefit, not to restrain you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the King. That's the goal, you guys, undivided devotion to Jesus. That is the goal. Whether you're single or married, the goal is undivided devotion to Jesus. And listen, you can do that as a married person, but it's going to require you to adopt this mindset, the overlap of the ages mindset. Everything is about being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and doing the things Jesus did. And it's going to take more discipline, more energy, more effort to make your marriage about that, to live as if you're not married when you are married. It's going to take a lot more effort and a lot more discipline to live with undivided devotion to Jesus. It's easier to live with undivided devotion to Jesus as a single person than it is as a married person. It's just facts. It's just true. It's not bad. It's just true. Now, Paul says, listen, if any man is struggling to remain sexually pure towards his fiancée, then he can marry her. Marriage is not a sin in that instance. Now, that shouldn't be the only reason that should not be the only reason you get married, but that is a reason to get married. But Paul says this, whatever, and please hear me if you're a guy, he says, whatever man is firmly established, settled in his mind. This kind of man, he knows what he wants. He has a plan. He has a vision. He knows if he wants to get married or not, to her or to not her. He's clear thinking. He isn't trying to, find himself. He's not just wasting time. He knows his calling. He is going for it. He is determined in his heart. Does that make sense? That's the kind of man, that's the kind of man you're called to be. And listen, if you're not there yet, if you're still finding yourself and trying to discern God's calling in your life, that's fine. That's fine. Like, take time to do that. Just don't drag along a woman as you're trying to do that. Like, some of you guys, like, you're just now following Jesus, and you need to take some time to just be with Jesus before you even think about doing all this other stuff. Like, honestly, and that's not a criticism. That's just the truth. I'd say the same thing to myself when I got saved, honestly. Like, if you're not, like, a man who is settled in his mind, determined in his heart, he knows his calling, he is going for it. If you're not there yet, that's okay. Just take time to do that before you even think about marrying somebody else. And listen, Paul says, and if his desires are under control, that's important. If his desires are under control, as in he's the kind of guy who can curb his sexual desires and live pure, maybe even indefinitely. If that guy still wants to marry his fiance, then great. He does well. He can marry her. But if he doesn't want to get married, great too. Fantastic. The one who marries, Paul says, does well, and the one who refrains from marriage does even better. This is not about what's right or what's wrong. It's about what's good and what's even better. Does that make sense? Marriage and singleness. It's not about what's right or wrong. It's about what's good and even better. Because for Paul, the married life is not superior to single life. And I think that needs to be said because a lot of us don't believe that. We believe married life is superior to single life. No, like it's actually the opposite. Married life, that is not the way of Jesus. That is the Disney heresy that we've all been taught since we were kids. That it's all about finding your person and like, you know what, and that's your destiny. Like, listen, you do even better, Paul says, if you remain single. It's not weird or wrong. And singleness for Paul, this is really important. This is really important. If you are called to singleness or if you're currently single, and you all are, this is really important. Singleness for Paul is not freedom from responsibility. It is freedom for even more responsibility, right? It's not freedom from responsibility, it's freedom for even more responsibility. If you're called to singleness, it's not so that you can lay around, have no job, play video games all day, or just travel. For Paul, being single meant that he could preach Jesus, he could plant churches, he could go into prison and get beat up and get tortured. That is probably not like the best lifestyle if you want one of these. Like, you know what I mean? Like, honestly, you know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? It's not freedom from responsibility, it's freedom for even more responsibility. It's so that Paul can go get tortured and beat up and preach Jesus without restraint, without having to worry about the safety of his wife and his children. Does that make sense? For Paul, being single meant that he could do more for the kingdom. Because here's the thing, you guys, you don't need to be married to grow up and to make your life matter and to assume some responsibility now. You don't need to wait for that. So let's end here, last two verses. Paul says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as she lives. If her husband dies, she is free to remarry, but he must belong to the king. This is not Paul's advice here. This is not a suggestion. This is a command. This is a command, period. Listen, if you are in the not yet married group, like if that's you, like then whoever you marry must belong to the king, period. Not just like, oh, he believes in God. It's like, okay, so what? Most people do. Like, that doesn't mean anything to me. Like, or that he's spiritual. I don't even know what that means. Like, you know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, he's great. He's so spiritual. What does that mean? No. Like, he must belong to the master. He must be able to confidently and joyfully say, Jesus owns me. He is my master. And one day my daughter's going to grow up. She's going to be an adult, and then she can go make her own decisions. But as long as I have influence over her dating life, that is my only criteria for whoever dates her. It's my only criteria, and that will be my criteria. If she's following Jesus, my criteria for the one who wants to date her is, can you confidently and joyfully say, Jesus owns me, he is my master? That is my criteria for whoever wants to date my daughter, honestly. And that should be your criteria for someone who wants to pursue you. But, Paul says, in my opinion, like let's say like her first husband dies and she doesn't want to remarry, Paul says she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think Paul says that I too have the Spirit of God. There's so many young people, young single women, but also men. But notice Paul kind of focuses here on the women. So many young single women who follow Jesus, and they just think to themselves, you know, I'd be happier with a guy who kind of follows Jesus. I'd be more happy with that than I would be if I was alone. No, that's not true. That's not true. Paul just said you'd be happier alone. You would be happier alone. My gosh, like there's this one woman I'm thinking of. I went to high school with this guy, and his mom. She, lovely woman, loves Jesus with all her heart. She was married and is married to an unbeliever, and she would constantly tell young ladies in our ministry, don't make the same mistake I did. I mean, yes, praise God. God, through that union, brought about 2 children that she loves, and both those children are following Jesus to this day. So he took even her sin and her rebellion and her disobedience and brought about good from it. But she says, do not make the same mistake I did. And here's the thing, they're still happy. She is, happy is like not the right word, because it's not about happiness. She is still married to this day. They're still together. They're not divorced, and he is still, to this day, I don't believe, following Jesus. And she would tell all those young ladies in our youth ministry, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't. You think I'd be happier with someone who's like a B- on the following Jesus, thing than I would be alone. No, you'd be happier alone. You would be. That's what Paul believes. And listen, I know that Paul's words can be hard to believe in a culture that is so obsessed with love, but not even love, this warped, twisted definition of love. Like notice, nowhere in this passage does Paul mention falling in love. Because falling in love is not a good enough reason to get married. In the same way, falling out of love is not a good enough reason to get a divorce. Because love is way more than emotion, and marriage is so much more than happy times. Marriage is hard work that's worth it to those who are called to it. But marriage, what is marriage for? It is not just for your happiness. No, what is marriage for? Marriage is it's about friendship and partnership. It is about gardening, having a garden project, fulfilling your calling. Remember, your marriage is not built on your marriage, it's built on a calling, your garden project. It's about sexuality. It's about family. It's about new creation, becoming your true self in Jesus. That's what marriage is for. So the question for all of us is this: will getting married honestly help you or hold you back from God's call in your life? I know God's call in my life. For me, I figured that out. I'm determined in my heart. And I know with the calling God's put on my life, marriage is better for me. It's helped me, and it helps me in God's calling in my life. Will marriage help you in God's calling on your life, or will it hold you back? Now, before you quickly just triumphantly say, no, it's going to help me, it's going to help me, it's going to help me, I'll just say, calm down. Calm down. Maybe a better question is this: will it help you right now? Will it help you right now? That's a much better question. Will it help you now? Because at the end of the day, here's the thing, at the end of the day, whether you are married or single, the goal is the same: to have undivided devotion to Jesus. That is the goal. Whether you're I said the same thing to the group of married people last night. I say the same thing to you single people. Like, the goal is the same: to secure your undivided devotion to Jesus. That's the goal. That's the goal. May that be the goal for all of us, whether you're married or single. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this evening. God, I thank you for tonight. I love this ministry so much. I love that it was in the heart of our senior pastor, Pastor Jay, to create a ministry like this, a ministry where young adults, college and career, can come together and worship Jesus and discover the beauty and the joy of allegiance to him and living out apprenticeship to him in community. That's so amazing, God. It's so necessary. But God, I think so many of us, we're still believing a lie. We're still believing that we need to get to a certain stage or step or season of life. We've convinced ourselves we need to get there before we are fully able to better serve Jesus. We think I'll be a better follower of Jesus once I'm married, once I have a kid, once I make this much money. We do the same thing. So many of us think like, we do the same thing with possessions. We think, oh, I'll be generous when I'm making so and so much. If you're not generous now when you're poor, you're not going to be generous when you're rich. In the same way, if you're not following Jesus passionately now, contentment now, you are not going to be content later. Help us not believe that lie, that we need to attain a certain step or stage in life or season to, no, help us serve you, Jesus, in the present circumstances which we're called. There's nothing wrong with wanting marriage, nothing wrong with wanting a change in life, but help us not believe that is where we're going to be content, that we're going to be able to better serve you then when we get there. That's not how it works. God, I know that there is a demographic of young people. The church is primarily in the world today a demographic of young single persons who are trying to discern your call on their lives. And I pray that every single person in here would discern your call in their life. Before we even ask the question of whether or not I should get married or should not, what's primary? How can I best serve you, Jesus, and your kingdom? What are you calling me to? Will marriage help me with that? Will it hinder me? Help us to discern first and foremost, how can I secure undivided devotion to you, my King? And what do you want me to do in this world? How do you want me to partner with you and participate in your kingdom? Help us to ask those questions first before we even ask the question, will marriage help me with that or hinder me from that? Our priorities are so askewed. They're so backwards. And I get it. Nothing wrong with wanting the things that we want. They're human desires. And they're God-given desires. They're godly desires. There's nothing wrong with it. But Lord, we are all in a unique space in our lives. And I remember when I was sitting in their shoes, that's not a put down. Like, I just remember I was so much more available to do things for the kingdom. again, I'm serving the kingdom now. I'm building an outlet of the kingdom of God where you place me in the home you place me with my wife, with my children. It is sometimes when we're faithfully following you, Jesus, it's heaven on earth, and that is my first and foremost ministry. And yet, God, these single people here, they have so much availability right now to do things for you, Jesus, they will not be able to do once they get married. I don't want them to waste this season of their life. There's nothing wrong with keeping an open eye for a spouse. I mean, obviously, I don't want them to play Where's Waldo or Where's Wanda because that's not the main priority. At the same time, though, Lord, are we serving you in the present? Because we have so much more. This is the time of our lives that we'll probably have the most availability to serve you, Jesus, in ways that we will never be able to after new responsibility comes. It's not freedom from responsibility, it's freedom for even more responsibility. So God, I just pray for all these people here. I know their hearts. I know that they desire marriage, they desire family. There's nothing wrong with that, God. I'm not going to condemn that. Paul, your servant did not condemn that. Marriage is a good thing, but singleness is a good thing too. It's a gift. The season that they're in, even though it feels long and begrudging and dread, it's a gift. Help us not waste our singleness. Because God, if we waste our singleness now, there's no guarantee that we won't waste our marriage too. If we're not following you, Jesus, faithfully and grabbing at every opportunity now, if we're not securing undivided devotion to you, Jesus, now while we're not married, why do we expect that once we're married, we'll finally be fully committed to you, Jesus? We won't be. Help us be fully committed now. Undivided devotion to the King now. So that if we're called to marriage, if you have that in the cards for us, that when we get married, we're able to live as people who aren't really married. People who adopt this overlap of the ages mindset, where we got one foot in each world, one foot in this age and one foot in the age to come, the world that's coming. This world is passing away. My marriage is wonderful, but in its present form, it's passing away. And that's not a bad thing. It's such a gift. But God, it's passing away. It is meant for a purpose. It has a calling. We have a garden project that you've given us. That's the purpose of my marriage, not just so that I can sit around and be happy and have my happily ever after. No. It's to point to that day, Jesus, when you will come and all of heaven and earth will be married. That is what our marriage points to, and I pray it would point to that. I would pray it would point to that faithfully and consistently, that I would represent you, Jesus, in my home. And I pray for every single person here in this room, God. I pray that if I'm praying for the ones who you know their future and you know they are called to marriage, I pray for every one of them that they would marry someone who belongs to you, Jesus. That they would not settle for anything less than a person who says joyfully and confidently, I belong to Jesus. He's my master. He owns me. I pray that every person in this room would not settle for anything less than that. And if their future spouse is not in this room, I pray that you bless them tonight, Lord. And I pray that if their future spouse in this moment right now does not know you, that they would come to know you even tonight, that you would rescue them even tonight, Lord. So, Lord, we love you, and we thank you for this evening. I pray even now as we worship you and then go into small groups and talk about these things even more, I pray that you would, once again, Jesus, just secure our undivided devotion to you. That's what it's all about. We're so easily distracted by our present relationships or our jobs or all these responsibilities that we have, and those are all great. They're a gift from you. We have so much responsibility now, God. We can take on even more responsibility because we're single. So, God, just in all things, help us secure undivided devotion to you, Jesus, now. Please. Help us remain where we are when you called us, Lord.